afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning into our webinar today, Humanizing Transformation in a Hybrid Normal World, presented by SGInnovate in support of Deep Tech for Good. My name is Brian, and for those of you who don't know about us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore that invests in and helps build deep tech startups, talent, and communities. At SGInnovate, our work involves connecting with the global deep tech ecosystem, working with entrepreneurial scientists to bring their innovative research from lab to market, as well as developing deep tech talent. Today, we have a panel of amazing experts who will be discussing how we can achieve humane technological transformation in a rapidly changing world. I'd like to encourage our audience here today to share their thoughts on this topic and engage with our speakers by using the Q&A box below. I'd now like to take the time to introduce Philip, who will be our moderator for today. And with no further ado, I'll pass the time to Philip. Philip, please.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. My name is Philip Christian, and I'm all about putting the human in the transformation, because I believe that human transformation is our pathway for a good future, and frankly, that's a future that we're all invested in. So, to me, that I think really sums up also the opening message and the message around deep tech for good, which is essentially that we must make sure that technology is serving humanity rather than humanity serving tech. And I think that it's a fine line to be treading. So with that, we have a very interesting panel of perspectives, quite diverse perspectives coming from diverse places as well. Personally, for myself, it's Amsterdam this time. And for one of our panelists, Agnes, it's Paris. Agnes Kwek was in the Singapore admin service for a very long time. Some of you will know what that is. Others can, of course, ask. Then, during the pandemic, she experienced a pretty interesting job change because the job that she was doing was no longer there in a way. And it meant that she had an opportunity for reinventing her own world. Both in a career term and of course also in a personal focus. So more about that later from Agnes. So welcome, first of all. Then we have Roz. Roz is the founder and CEO of CXA, a business that was traditionally an insurance brokerage in a digital way and also a tech business at the same time. So two businesses kind of transforming the way benefits was done. What Roz told me about it was that it's the sort of 401k for benefits, which I really like that metaphor. But during the pandemic, what happened was that the brokerage business sort of downsized quite significantly and the tech business began thriving. So really an interesting transformation story there as well of shifting focus and of course the silver lining that we can all be experiencing from the pandemic. And then finally, Steve, who was DBS Bank's first Chief Innovation Officer, like back in the day, I should say, who also is varyingly invested in technology companies, both building them and also growing them, and is now coming to us from Tokyo. Roz is coming to us from Singapore, I believe, as far as I can tell. Yeah. And so we have a really nice kind of diverse and also diversely located panel, as you do nowadays, because this is, of course, the hybrid normal. And with that in mind, I'd like us to be having a conversation and engaging around three perspectives today. The first perspective is the me. Yeah, that's you. The idea that every one of us in the last 18 months has somewhat been undergoing a personal transformation, responding to the pandemic, perhaps finding a new job, perhaps just dealing with things in a new way. And I think it's a really interesting point of introspection for how technology can actually be supporting a bright future for us as individuals. The second thing, also to do with transformation, is speaking indeed about the us, what connects us, the purpose that is required in bringing everyone on the same page, creating that common ground and collaborating to solve this pandemic, but beyond that, to bring back a sense of purpose into technology. And then, of course, there's also the we, which is essentially about how we actually collaborate effectively and how we bring back agility in times of friction, times where there's a lot of checks and balances, times where trust is really a precious commodity because of the pandemic, but also because of, I think, a business world that has paid lip service to certain things for the longest time and is now finally challenged to really make change. So if you think about it, those three perspectives, they represent the living it, the dreaming it, and the doing it. The me, the us, and the we. And with that, I want to be leading over. And, I'd like to be starting with that personal angle. Agnes, you've had a pretty big transformation over the last 18 months. And I'm curious, what was that like from your end? And how has maybe the role of technology, even in your work life, evolved as a response to that?
Yeah, Philip. For all of you out there who think that, a government job is probably the most stable one that you can have, I'm a living proof that it's not. My job before was, my last position was a design ambassador for Singapore, covering Europe and North America. So as Philip introduced, I'm based in Paris, and I moved from Singapore to Paris in 2018 for family reasons. And for the last 2 years, prior to the pandemic, my role has really been to promote Singaporean design brands overseas, promote Singapore as a location for design and creativity. And this includes talking to lots of different stakeholders, not just design brands, but technology companies and digital companies as well. And with the pandemic, all of that came to a standstill. Going around, Europe to all the different design weeks in London and Milan was suddenly not happening anymore. I know, I had a dream job really. And that face-to-face meeting was just not there anymore. And really that's how business gets done. And when all that sort of came to a standstill, then it had me sort of wondering, what value am I really adding? And do I just want to hang on in there? Or try something else. So I decided to try something else. I came out to set up my own freelance consultancy as of May this year. And it can't be a bigger change, right? Going from a stable government career of 20 years to suddenly being a freelance entrepreneur. But just as COVID has killed off my previous job, it has made the current one possible. Now I'm working with governments and companies from all around the world that previously would not have been possible before. So it's literally, as I say, when one door closes, another opens. But I think what has really shown to me is actually it is not what I do, but what I can offer. And when I sat down to really think about what is it that I want to do for my next stage in life, what has my 20 years of career brought as an offer, the one thing I can think about is that I know how to handle complexity. And in this age and time, we're in the greatest flux of complexity. And I see individuals, organizations, and the public sector really struggling to get a hold on this. So maybe that's something that we can talk about later, but there's so many forces coming in together currently, right? And how do we as a society and also as individuals try to handle the complexity, which comes down to really this: how do we thrive in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty?
Yeah, and Agnes, in fact, you kind of teed it up for me there because, a lot of the work that is out there that I used to do pre-pandemic was around the value of trust. The value and the changing nature of trust in the digital era. We've separately had conversations about this in multiple ways, and every one of you has their own story about that, why trust matters so much, and sometimes it may be a bit difficult to understand. But I think the pandemic has shown us very clearly that without trust, we really are just a bunch of islands. And those bunch of islands, need to find a way of connecting. And that's very difficult if there is distrust, right? If you don't know if somebody has a potentially very dangerous virus, then you kind of have to distrust them. And technology can smooth that over a bit, but we see varyingly different approaches. We see a completely different horizon. And I think the ambiguity really is a challenge for us to remind ourselves of something really simple. It's that as humans, we are naturally born with agility. That's just how we're wired. Humans, we're adaptable, we're evolving, and we're wired to be agile. Yet we sort of go through an education system that tells us that somebody else has the answer and that we can't possibly trust ourselves, that we have to trust someone else who's an expert who will tell us how the world really is. And that works well in a stable environment, but in a VUCA world, it kind of completely just blasts. And that means whatever the new normal may be for you, trust me, it's not going to be normal. It's going to be back to a hopefully more human approach. And what that means, I think we can be discussing as well, because I feel human is often the antidote to complex. And we can talk about that a little bit. Ross, you had a very interesting story to tell about your business. And in fact, your business, if I understand it correctly, has always been about managing and taking out complexity out of insurance brokerage, taking out the frustration. So how has your business evolved? And isn't it funny that the technology side of your business is thriving? Because quite naturally, the pandemic has put technology on a pedestal, hasn't it?
It has, it has. So before the pandemic happened, I had 330 people. We had 1 million clients in 3 countries.
Right. Right.
But during COVID, no one wanted to see our face-to-face brokers, except in China, where it recovered fairly quickly. So we had to make a really hard decision. At the same time, we noticed during COVID that the insurance industry finally had urgency to digitize. So we took a huge bet. We sold off all of our brokers in Singapore, Hong Kong, and in China, and bet it all on our tech business. So we went from 330 people to 15. Imagine 95% of your people gone. So it was a huge bet. And the difficulty is that 75 of those people who worked for me in the brokers followed me from my last firm. And you know how hard it is to get someone from a very large corporation to join a startup. So it was very painful. And I used to think I was a cockroach that can survive the nuclear holocaust. Now I think of myself as a lizard. I can cut off all my limbs just so that the body can survive, so that these limbs will grow back, right? So, but our tech business took off. So for one insurer, over the last 6 months, they were able to win 200 SMEs in 6 months without people walking into the branches. And
It's pretty fascinating, right? Yeah.
It would have taken 5 years for each one of my brokers to do that.
Right. So acceleration, right?
It. Yes,
that's
it accelerated.
Awesome. So. And I think it's that kind of punch in the face, you know, when you get up at 6 a.m. to do that soul destroying and body destroying HIIT class, and you feel amazing afterwards, but you had somebody pushing you through that. That's sort of the personal effect of the pandemic. I think it's really interesting that you say this. We have a few comments as well, which I'll be weaving in, of course, so that we can kind of respond to that. But I have a story similar to that, and I'll lead that to then lead over to Steve, because you know, for us as in the last couple of years as keynote speakers, of course, like nobody expected the scale of the change, right? Going from traveling all the time to traveling not at all. And this is an industry that had to learn the value of technology, because a lot of, I think, the speaking world still is very traditional and old school. So there is that same kind of chasm. The more traditional the industry, you know, the more you see the difference in tech adoption. And I had a client last year, actually an Indian kind of insurance company, that said, you know what, we actually digitized all of our distribution almost overnight. And we actually had a much better year than before. But the CMO told me that if they had tried this in a normal year, their people would have just left and told them that they were insane. So the irony is that this really dire pandemic has actually kind of shown us the power of and the strength of our humanity, the fact that we can in fact adapt so quickly and that we can even do it for the better. It's, you know, the actual term here is super compensation. I don't know if you heard it, but if you go mountaineering, you climb a large mountain, your body becomes like very, very stressed and very weak. But once you're back, your blood values, everything shoots through the roof because your body sort of super compensates. I think as a society, we are super compensating for the pandemic. And, you know, Steve, you've been kind of both on the startup side and also on the corporate side driving transformation. How has this acceleration maybe shown for you? Or also, you know, how hasn't it shown in certain organizations? Love to hear about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. When the pandemic began, I was EVP in a Saudi bank, and what you could see happening in China, which is just so remote from Saudi Arabia, but you could see 4 million SMEs about to go bankrupt, which by any stretch of the imagination was unbelievable. And when you actually calculated and used technology to start calculating the numbers and the impact of that, it was very clear that most companies, most SMEs, only really had survival period of about 20 days in any country. Right? You know, just to give you a magnitude of the problem that was approaching. And yet in Saudi is, you know, a completely different world. No one could see the implications that would spread. But, you know, what we've just been through is an exponential experience. You know, the pandemic and the way that it spread is actually driven on an exponential curve, as we now know. But in technology, I think that's something that was very obvious. And what's interesting for me is that even though we have the tools, we have technology, ultimately it's the humans that make the decisions around these things still. And that's the interesting disconnect for me. And I'll give you a more personal thing. So when I left Saudi Arabia, I caught an evac flight and made my way back to Tokyo. But I have a son stuck in Hong Kong. I have another in Sweden and another in Finland. And so, while we have technology, I couldn't imagine going through this pandemic without Zoom. So I can communicate with my kids every day. But it doesn't kind of replace the authenticity of interaction, which is quite interesting for me at a human level. But you actually see that same challenge occurring in the business level. While you might have tools that are helping us translate and and speak across languages and all this sort of thing, that disconnect between what is said and what is communicated is still a massive issue. So now you have obviously very polarized societies, around vaccination, anti-vaccination, fake news, real news. It's becoming the very tools that we've created to propagate, to actually connect and improve the way we communicate have actually almost taken us in the opposite direction. How we use those tools and how we, use them in an asymmetric way to create, new businesses, as you've seen Ros and Agnes do. For me, it's been very beneficial. But, still, when you look back at the real challenge is never about the technology. It's always about humanity. Exactly, when we began the transformation journey at DBS, technology was abundant. And nothing to do with technology, but it really had to do with how you got people behind the technology, not afraid of it, able to use it, which is why, you have to learn, venture, and then throw capital, not the old model of throw capital, then try and work out how to use it. And then the learning is never do that again. And I think that that's the real synthesis that's still yet to take place in a lot of companies today.
I do think so. And I think that we have gotten away with a very technocentric view for way too long. The way I've framed it quite provocatively is the sort of distrust epidemic. This idea that we have layered and layered more and more distrust because the complexity was just exploding even decades before the pandemic. And organizations, like if they're run in a classic bureaucratic structured way, right, they had to put everything in boxes. So the world was getting more volatile and strange and uncertain, and organizations just kept adding boxes, right? So in the end, like in an oyster, you get a pearl, but in an organization, you get just cluster F, right, as a result of that. So I think that kind of was a very urgent change. And I like how, Steve, you said, I rely on Zoom. Yesterday, we had this conversation, like, imagine doing this 20 years before, with ISDN modems and with sort of like long distance phone calls, right? It would have been a disaster. So clearly, evidently, the potential of technology for humanizing in any situation and for connecting us, in fact, on those very bridges of trust, right? What we might call the trust economy or the digital economy or the sharing economy. All of those things are still there. It is just about how do we as organizations use these things and how do we make this human? Steve, you want to add? I'd love that. I think you have a lot to add there. Of course.
I'll add something that Ros, given her background, might appreciate. What technology does for me is always to arbitrage time. So if this had happened back in the time that you'd suggested, I remember downloading a file from Phil Kelly once, staying up for 3 hours one morning on a 56K modem while it arrived, only to find out that he had just CC'd me on something that I'd sent to him. So we're solving a lot of the technology issues, but still many of the human issues remain.
And I think speaking of that, I'll be very honest, right? For me, the transition from trust to kind of putting the transformation, the human transformation, center and front ultimately, that also was a realization that came from the pandemic, because I started realizing, hey, that, the value of trust is ultimately an individual one. It's that we have to trust ourselves and we have to trust other people. So it kind of starts with us, right? And what tends to happen to most people when you get punched in the face is there's a big question of what do you do next, right? Your plan is basically gone, right? The 2020 budget, right? Whoever worked on the 2020 budget, I think we can kind of like agree that that was sort of a write-off, right? So when that happens, you basically fall to the level of your self-trust. Because if your plan is gone, all you have is yourself. And I think all we did have was ourselves and our families, at least in the initial stages, right? And then people started realizing that, you know, actually this connection thing really matters. And this is really what technology can be providing. Before I bring this back to Roz and Agnes, I do want to quickly talk about the comments from Bruno and Darren. I think you know, there are some questions here. Maybe actually some of you want to be taking that. Bruno is asking kind of, you know, there are some sectors and new businesses that grow during the pandemic. Does humanizing transformation mean the future of work is better for people in these new businesses? And I think it's a very fair point, Bruno, because we've seen lots of winners and losers in the pandemic. Maybe we start off with that. What are you seeing in the business world? Maybe Roz and Agnes, if you want to weigh in on that. What are you seeing? What are some good and bad stories, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to take that. As Steve pointed out just now, you know, the complexity is not about technology, it's about humans. And when humans are involved, it just inevitably gets messy, right? Super messy. And in all my years in the government sector, we've always seen this play out where there's disruption and there's change, there will be winners and losers. And what we're seeing now is that it's been almost like a decade, 2 decades of digital revolution and transformation. And there's a long tail of workforce that are vulnerable to this. They don't have the digital skills, their jobs are not being redesigned to take advantage of that. And what happens to them? They're left behind. So even though businesses may not have to necessarily think about this, it's not their jobs to think about, you know, the people that have downsized, but governments think about that and countries think about that. But eventually, we're all part of it because it's going to create a lot of unhappiness and the growing polarization. So if as a business, we're not thinking about, okay, what's going to happen to the workers whose jobs are displaced with technology, it's going to come back and bite you eventually somewhere. Maybe not 2 years down the road, not 5, but could be 10, when you realize that it's precisely, you know, that trust between institutions, citizens, individuals is broken. And sometimes you don't see that. I mean, it really depends on which society you live in. For me, coming from Singapore, where there's a lot of societal trust and strong social fabric, and a lot of trust in governments to say, all right, what are the different policy outcomes that we're rolling out for low-wage workers, elderly workers? There's a lot of trust and tripartite cooperation between unions and businesses and government. That's great. But the moment I moved to France and it's les manifestations, you know, every weekend and the whole city comes to a standstill, those are 2 really different societies. But it doesn't mean, and we should never take for granted that Singapore can't move towards that kind of, you know, the French model, right? If people just have enough of it,
It's a bold point, Agnes, and it's funny because it crossed my mind yesterday. I'm obviously in the Netherlands right now, and just the approach couldn't be more extremely different, right? I think actually, to be kind of a little bit provocative here as well, is I think Singapore absolutely nailed the technology aspect of, you know, facilitating pandemic response. I think they've done a tremendously good job, you know. The check-in, it's all very seamless. I think Europe has absolutely nailed the human aspect of that. There is a lot of solidarity, a lot of kind of community, and there's a lot of kind of we're in this together, but genuinely that. But there's also, of course, that you get more polarization here, right? I saw this massive anti-vaxxer demo like kind of 2 days ago, and people just sit there kind of shrugging, right? As I'm like, yeah, we can't do anything about it. This is what people are doing. So I think we've got to be careful when we talk about humanization that we just talk about humanization at any cost. In the same way that we should be very careful talking about technocracy at any cost. I think we've seen time and time again that both of those are absolutely stupid. It is about how can we be using, in fact, deep tech and humanity and humanism, rehumanization for good, right? Which brings us back to, I think, what Darren is asking. He's asking, well, humanizing is an interesting term. Does that make transformation less painful? So I'm thinking, you know, kind of putting this back to Roz. Did your human touch make your transformation less painful? Because it does sound like a pretty radical one on your end.
It was pretty radical. I had to speak to a lot of people even before we announced, just to let them know that we were making this big bet, but they would be affected. So yeah, it matters how you communicate this and the reason why. and to get people over this sense of betrayal, because they will feel it.
And I think that brings us to the emotive layer as well, right? Like we've heard that the complexity is actually human, it's not on the tech. And in fact, if tech, I think we like blaming technology when it isn't working, kind of forgetting that somebody made that technology, right? And somebody designed it in a certain way, and that's the reason why it's screwed up. The technology in itself has like absolutely zero interest in kind of what it is that we do with it, but it's really our intention and the way we're using it that makes all the difference. So when we talk about the emotive, the soft factor, really what actually drives us as leaders, that drives us as organizations, and that has been very deliberately ignored by the technocracy and the bureaucracy for a long time. Right? When we're bringing that back, we're noticing now, I think, an increased focus on mental well-being, on mental health. Agnes was telling me that in the government, there is a much bigger emphasis on kind of, psychological well-being. I like hearing all of these stories. I'm wondering from all of you, this renewed emphasis, of course, to most of us will see like, duh, as in we kind of knew this mattered. But do you think that organizations are doing a good job of actually operationalizing that? This is where we go from the purpose to sort of, maybe the collaboration aspect. Like, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I just saw a message flash up from Darren, and I think that, we should, as human beings, we all have different opinions. And actually, it's borne out in physics, Einstein's theory of relativity. If two people are looking at the same thing from a different perspective, they'll draw different conclusions.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a black and white page, a multi-sided page, the person is looking at one way and going, it's white, and the person that's looking from a different perspective is going, it's black, and both will be 100% correct. And you see this in big, transformation, so I've seen this in banks where I introduced AI to a couple of banks, and I did the first AI underwriting engine in insurances, So, but what I've found, the key is to actually respect the opinions and the perspective, because actually the differences in perspective are often right. These are experts that you're dealing with within organizations. But what really matters is turning a no into a no. And what I mean by that is a NO into a KNOW. So people can actually make informed decisions the right way on the balance of information. So if we have an information asymmetry, you're more likely to get an NO. And that's why for me, transformation at board level really has to start with, I'm joining the board of supposedly of Middle Eastern Bank now. And one of the things I said is the board has to be the one that's committed to learning about technology, because you can't make an ethical decision on technology to actually understand what it is. Otherwise, your fiduciary responsibility is to actually say no. And which is why we get so many no's in technology when we introduce new types of technology. It's because people are afraid of what they don't know.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about information and information asymmetry, this does, I think, also talk to Darren's point there, that, information really is a critical aspect of this. I think nobody should be expecting someone to be okay and go along with something without having actually had a decent explanation. But I think as everything in life, it's give and take. So it's both a matter of ultimately contributing to the greater good and then also availing from that greater good, right? In the same way, I think like the smart nation that we're seeing in Singapore, it's not just about people, embracing and investing in smart technology, but it's of course also people benefiting from a smart city. In the same way, right, if I want to be basically looking at the European model, right, the welfare system works because some people draw and some people pay. And there is a shared sense that as long as this remains in equilibrium and balance, everybody wins. But the moment people start kind of putting themselves above the rest, that's the moment things start derailing. And I think that is also the difficult conversation here to be having, because it's so easy for a leader to say, you know what, we're going to humanize, and that means my interests come first. No. Your interests as an individual are very important, and you have your own transformation journey, but it is about how you then connect that to someone else, how you communicate that to someone else, right? And how you make it about the greater good. And I do think purpose is a great way of framing that. Perhaps what I see globally is there's a complete lack of cohesive communication and education around why it makes sense to actually be aligned, to find common ground. So perhaps when we talk about the operational side of it, do you really think that people nowadays are more like misaligned than they were before? Or do you think the pandemic is actually bringing us all together? Like, what do you guys think? Maybe Agnes, like, what's your feel on that?
Yeah, I think it depends on whose perspective you're coming from. And I see different challenges. Let's say you're a startup and you have technology that you can offer to the market. I think very often the focus is too much on designing the technology in itself rather
Yeah.
than the organization and the vehicle that will deliver the technology. So how are you thinking in terms of designing your company's purpose, the company's culture, how you hire, attract the right kinds of people, and also how do you
Yeah.
reach out to your supply chain, both upstream and downstream, to make sure that that purpose is aligned and you're finding the right partners for it. So currently, I'm consulting for a couple of startups, and it always has to start with trying to identify what is the purpose that you're there, not what the technology does, but what problems are you trying to solve, and then have that really flow through the entire organization. Um, but the challenges are different if you talk about, huge banks and governments and corporations. They've been built up over decades, if not centuries, and have so much already hardwired
Yeah.
practices and practice sets, right? And the whole idea is that, are those practice sets still relevant for today's challenges? And if they're not, how do we inbuild a whole new sort of muscle memory that is always agile and always able to shift with the times? And what I've observed also as not just a civil servant, but as a sociologist and a keen study of complexity is that we all carry with us our personal biases and personal preferences of doing things in a certain way. Either that is through the way that we've been educated. Our first 20 years of professional life has been in this kind of corporate culture, but inevitably we carry that with us. And what the pandemic has shown me is that when our backs are against the wall and we're throwing our hands up in panic and trying to figure out what to do, we will always revert to that personal preference way of working. And for example, in the Singapore civil service, it's let's layer on more rules. The more, the better. And that's how you get an infographic of, I don't know if you remember the time where dining out was extended to 5 people, and you have 20 different combinations depending on whether you're vaccinated or tested negative, a number of people in your households. It was so mind-boggling that McDonald's just went, fuck it, 2 people, that's it, right? and I think that is so. And the question is, how do we keep calm, take a deep breath and go, all right, how do we design our way out of this so that we can communicate and we can continue to still build trust, but be, just be readily understood. So what are we doing on a daily basis to try to question our own personal biases and preferences and make that part of our muscle memory?
I think it's a very bold point, and frankly, the irony is that simplicity actually takes quite a lot of effort. I'm building on your point there, Agnes, because what we're actually seeing is that under stress, people often, they default to the preferred way of working, but they default to the preferred way of working, which is like their default stress response. So most people, and I think Singapore is a perfect example for that. High social trust, genuinely actually trying to sort of figure out what's the best way of doing things. Then under pressure, right, you fall back to the old way, which is just rules and reassurance. And I think that's perfectly human, right? It's the same for most of us. We may be very kind of, open-minded most of the time, but when we're super stressed, we become narrow. I think it happens. And I think this is exactly why the humanization is important, because when you're layering more and more rules, what you're actually doing is you're trying to take the human out of the equation, but you can never design enough rules for compliance to be perfect. In fact, what we notice, at least from the stories that I've heard in banking, is less rules lead to greater compliance. And I think the really interesting silver lining here is talking about the outcome. Where do we want to be going? Right? And this is something that we can be embodying with our individual story, but the outcome could also be creating that universal common ground that we're all seeking. Because, Ros, when you started your business, I know it's a deeply personal story for you, right? You had a deep motivation for why you made this bet. But I'm sure it also was exciting for others that you are simplifying an industry that was just not doing the job, right? How do you feel about that? Do you think that the personal can be connected with that greater purpose? And how has your business changed? How has your organizations changed from that pivot? How has it been changing?
biggest reason I started this business and spent all my life savings on it was a request from one of my biggest Chinese clients. They were an insurance client. They bought insurance. And you know what they told me? We bought cancer insurance, but we found too many late stage cancers. Why can't someone connect it to early detection so that we prevent this from happening? So my whole purpose is that it's not about insurance and waiting for treatment. Why can't we do the early detection and manage this through? And so I've spent the last 8 years building an ecosystem, connecting the lab results, connecting the doctors, connecting mental health, connecting financial health, physical health, right? And leaving people with a choice. If we can, if you can decide what you want to do with the money, tailor it to your life. It doesn't have to be the rules of HR in your company. And so we were ready for the pandemic. Not my brokers, but the tech was ready, because it's not just about waiting for treatment. It really is about prevention and wellness. And so that's why our business has thrived.
And I think, you know, Roz, when you say that, prevention is also an exponential curve, right? If you eat a donut today, it's not going to give you cancer or heart attacks tomorrow. It's going to take some time, most of the time, you know, touch wood. So the idea is that we're all on an exponential curve of change, right? So the small habits that we build today, they're not necessarily going to immediately land us in the ditch or kind of in the great alternative to that, like sort of thriving self. They're eventually going to do that. And that means persistence, of course, is key, because it's very easy to fall into a bad habit every day. But, you know, getting up every morning for that yoga class or whatever and having that smoothie, even though you think it's disgusting initially, that is probably going to do the trick. And I think technology can have such a big impact. Of course, with yesterday's outage, you know, on some of the big tech tools, it's, I think, an interesting reminder as well that also, you know, big tech is no longer the poster child. In fact, they're far from it nowadays, right? They are very much the new incumbents, because a lot of what big tech is built on is instant gratification. It's the quick scratch. You know, it really was the tech world pre-pandemic was still caught up in this scratching the itch kind of mindset. And I think what we're seeing now, hopefully, is a renewed focus on well-being, and actually not just the human side from a mental health point of view, but also from a physical health point of view. Understanding that perhaps in, you know, making sure that public health is going to be good in future, we also have to be encouraging people to, you know, adopt all sorts of healthy behaviors, and hand sanitizing is one of them, right? But it's a bit like, if you focus on just that, it's like saying, hey, please brush your teeth, but you don't give any mention to the effects of sugar, right? To me, it's a little bit short-sighted. I think there needs to be a bigger picture. And I want to be expanding that horizon a little bit, because I do believe that, yeah, we fall to the capability of our people, no matter how much technology is in the business. Of course, if you're a factory where robots are building robots, like is happening in certain parts of Japan, then you don't have to worry about this. But if you want someone to buy those robots, right, there again, you have humans, so you can't escape it. And I think with that in mind, you know, there's a nice horizon to be built here around how we can actually be setting a vision for the future of humanity that sort of creates a least common denominator, that puts us all on the same page, that gives us all a sense of coming back to the table and moving from maybe the great disillusionment and the great reset and whatever you want to call it, right, to that great humanization, understanding that we're all fundamentally the same. So in terms of that, right, maybe let's have a look at some of the questions that are coming up, because some of these are very specific. And Roz, there's one question I think for you, which sort of dovetails into what you were saying. It's from Bruno again, and I'll mention Zach's and Andre's question later as well. Would CXA ever return to the old days after the pandemic, not just in terms of number of staff, but the way you were engaging with your clients? And how do you see the new future of work at CXA? I was going to lead over to the future of work, so it's a perfect question for this time. Thanks, Bruno. Roz, what's your view on that?
No, I don't think we'll ever go back, because we're a very asset-light model. If I can build a platform that insurers could use to cross-sell their bank partners and get the same number of clients in 6 months that took me 5 years, I would never go back. And we're on a very healthy path to profitability.
Right.
Also, what we've learned is that banks and insurers can not only sell to SMEs very simply at a lower cost without all of the middlemen, because we've eliminated them all. They can pass the savings back, but each individual, we're actually getting penetration rates of employees of all the SMEs and larger corporates. So yeah, no, the tech works, and we've now proven that there is a new distribution model and employee benefits can be profitable if you can cross-sell banking and insurance and health products to each employee as they need.
And I think this is perhaps also a case for integrating, right? I think the future of work is well, it's fundamentally about people. I think we've covered that. But it was also, I think, in the last decade, it was very much the future of work, as in it was sort of all still about work and it was going to happen one day. I think now we're entering kind of the future of working, where it's no longer about you just doing a certain job, but it's about you finding various ways of adding value to your organization, whether that's as a freelancer, whether it's as a kind of CEO, whether it's as, you know, a full-time employee. It doesn't matter anymore. And I think those boundaries, those lines are blurring. But talking about blurring lines, I also want to pose a question back to Steve. There's a really nice one here from Andre. It's basically like he believes that people aren't really trusting tech that much anymore. Or I would say there's a sort of skepticism, right, in certain parts of technology. There was that blunder with WhatsApp a few months, I think, ago, right, which caused some interesting headlines, some misunderstanding. And so he's asking, do you see a big issue with unethical use of technology in your industries? With your background in deep tech, Steve, maybe that's an interesting one to take.
Yeah, I think there's always the risk that technology can be used for good or for bad. I mean, that's true of almost everything in humanity, right? And you do see technology being abused in markets in ways, you know, as we've seen in the recent Facebook discoveries, actually, you know, around some of the youth markets, etc., where they're directly aware of what the technology does, but they're still making very unethical decisions about how it's deployed. And so, you know, the real point about that is that the ethics in technology come from humans. And, you know, we often make decisions that are often driven, you know, around either self-interest or profitability, which is probably usually tied to self-interest. And that often just, you know, stops you getting to really good outcomes. So, you know, the problem actually sits with us, and that's not something that technology is going to solve. You know, in the underwriting thing that we went through, you know, we got automation rates in you know, high 90s, and this was a long time ago, right? So it's about 10 years ago. Right. And, you know, and it was just phenomenal. We could have economically doubled the business, but what it would have meant is that, you know, for an insurance company, that their most valuable employees, the underwriters and actuaries, you would likely, if you're automating 90+% of the work, you've got to question, will they still have roles? Now, my answer to that is, if you actually think beyond technology, you would want those people to help you grow the business in other areas. So, but what we do with technology is we look at it as a one-hit solution. So I implement an AI and I go, great, it's going to have this impact. No one thinks about the human impact. So, you know, if I was doing an M&A where there was the risk of 90% of employees becoming unemployed, HR would be involved at the get-go. I've never heard of an AI project in a major organization where HR is involved at the get-go of the project. And I think that's a huge miss on behalf of most of the corporations.
And I think what a wonderful point leading over to another question here as well from Zach, which is basically, for Agnes, I'd say, there is a concern for a larger digital divide as our world is accelerating the use of tech during the pandemic. Do you see this an issue in your industries or in our region? I think this could be answered for Singapore and for maybe France and Europe.
Yeah, well, the answer is absolutely, for all the reasons that Steve said just now. And also, if you think about it, then the profits of digitalization and using technology is privatized, but the negative externalities are made are nationalized, right? Socialized rather. And taxpayers end up paying for unemployment benefits for that, end up paying for the need to reskill, new programs. And there just needs to be a better way of bringing businesses and unions together with governments to address the long tail of what happens to this digital divide. And it won't just play out in the labor force. You'll see it play out in education as well. Just the most obvious example was during the pandemic, we all had to go into home-based learning. And when you go into every individual household, there's so much complexities involved. Some kids don't even have their own tables and chairs. Families share one entire room. How do you ensure a conducive environment? So it really comes down to it's still back to the physical surroundings at the end of the day of how we're going to thrive in this increasingly digitalized world. And I think what this pandemic has shown is that there needs to be stronger safety nets around the world, right? Even the US now, for all their philosophical mistrust of big governments, they have no choice but to put in a $3 trillion policy package in order to shore up vulnerable families, because the tech may not be there in the future, but these people are. They're alive. They're still going. The kids are going to grow up and be the next generation of your workforce. And what happens to them today is going to determine how successful we are at handling critical challenges tomorrow of climate, of geopolitical cooperation, of making the world a safer place in terms of cyber, and it just starts with not thinking that giving a technological platform or the digital platform is going to solve every problem, but because for a lot of people it's not.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant way of answering that. Also, I think there is this interesting digital divide in the context of trust, right? We are so used to just default trusting people online because of ratings and data. And a lot of that is, of course, value, which goes back into the tech companies, right? Because they get very handsomely rewarded for that intermediation. And in fact, as we're seeing now, of course, whilst there are changes, it's still a very, very good business. So that means also on a generational level, right? Younger generations tend to be more trusting. They tend to be more default trusting. So there's a very high speed of trust there. And there's a very low speed of trust in the offline world with mounting distrust, right? With a lot more skepticism and with a world where somehow also, people are feeling left behind or feeling alienated, and everybody sort of thinks that their perspective is the right one and it's unique. So there's a lot of dissonance there. And of course, these worlds, they mesh. Sometimes they wash over, right? Maybe kind of the keyboard warrior moments are sort of where they wash over, where the dissonance of the old world meets the sort of fluidity of the new world. But I believe the great risk that might be, kind of something we're confronting is that the perspectives are drifting further and further apart. And when that happens, we end up gridlocked, right? Because then the old and the new can't sort of synergize and come together, but they're sort of pivoted separately. And I think that may actually be an interesting way for us to be also figuring out a better way of how we can be interweaving technology and reality, or digitalism and, your classic old economies with their governments and their legacies and all of the things that ultimately serve good purpose, but may also need to be renovated in some way, shape or form. There's a question here which I think is really interesting, and it's a bit of a brain teaser or twister from Fiona. Is it then better to digitize human transformation or humanize digital transformation? I personally feel it's the human that is transforming, enabled by groundbreaking technology. Now, I will quickly answer that and then open it up, and we'll have a few more questions as well from the audience. So, Fiona, basically, I think it is very much a spectrum of both, because first of all, there is a way that technology can be supporting our own transformation. But if I were to kind of, pivot A versus B, I actually think that, humanizing digital transformation is a bigger priority than digitizing human transformation. And the only caveat is for those of us that are actually being left out, that are currently being denied the chance of transforming because they're denied the chance of being educated about important things, that they're simply caught in a bubble where maybe, there is the assumption that there are few options. For those, you know, maybe less of the benefactors of the digital divide, but for those that are being left behind. For those, I think it is about digitizing human transformation, because the cost of transformation and the effectiveness and the distribution of the transformation is a lot more significant and a lot easier with technology. But for everybody who is already using, you know, and is already part of the digital economy in full swing and who's thriving in that, I think there it is about, you know, pausing and putting the human back in focus. Especially if you are addicted to your smartphone, I think it's a very obvious metaphor that, you know, often it's us serving the technology and serving the companies behind that. And the paradigm shift here really is technology going back to serving us. I will give all of you a chance maybe for this question to be weighing in as well. And then we have 2 more questions. So I think maybe we can just get a quick kind of, you know, barometer from each of you. Perhaps Roz, you want to weigh in, and then we'll have Steve and Agnes as well. And then I'll go for the 2 final questions. And if any one of you wants to get in another question, I'm happy to do that now. All right, Roz, take it away.
So I'm answering Darren's question, you know, how has COVID affected healthcare? Because we connect the whole health ecosystem. We saw a huge surge in demand for telemedicine. One of the banks decided to use our platform, and they went out to their retail clients and said, hey, health is wealth. How can we find a doctor that you can see non-remotely? How can we find you mental health help, you know, nutrition help? You know, so healthcare can be remote now if needed. Not the complex healthcare, but it can deliver to your house. And we saw that, you know, in our platform.
I think it's really interesting, Roz, because when you were saying this, I was just imagining like a surgeon coming to your house and just sort of said, I think that's what we don't want, right? What we want is just for as much as possible to be done in a distributed way, because that relieves and takes the pressure off the actual hospital, right? So nice analogy there. And I think, again, there's an acceleration there, right? Steve, like you can actually choose any question that is still there if you want to. Or also respond to Fiona's question. It's entirely up to you. What do you think?
Actually, I'll just take the one that just flashed up from Darren about the digital divide. And I think that this is a pressing priority for governments everywhere, because it's not too different to the Gini coefficient. And in many ways, it's, you know, this wealth disparity, which is growing and getting to breaking point in many countries around the world and causing all sorts of problems, is being exacerbated and accelerated by technology. You know, where the poorest don't have access to the same tools, they're not, you know, given the opportunity to learn, they're not given the opportunity to participate. And that has to change, because the very things that drive digital is actually that diversity and that access to new thinking. And one of the big problems as we go back to the issue of bias is that many of these fantastic algos, etc., are often designed by people who have no experience at the other end of the pyramid. You know, so, you know, I was with a senior executive in a country somewhere, virtually, and who was explaining that there are only 100,000 poor people in the country. And this is a country that has one of the largest Gini coefficients on the planet. He had this just complete misrepresentation of the need for money, you know, within that economy from people that I know have trouble with, you know, live in shoebox housing and all that sort of thing. So you have this complete disconnect from people that are designing and giving the green light to a lot of these things. And I think that we have a responsibility, and I think it's a government responsibility, is to ensure that people have not only access to technology, but are trained. And if I may, a plug for a former employer, and one of the things that I admire about DBS is that they did extend those learning programs to everyone. So there's no reason to be afraid of Python because they're trained in Python. AI, same, they've trained everyone across the bank, whether you're a lawyer or any. So everyone has an understanding of what it means and how to take advantage of it. Back to you, Phil.
Right. Agnes, and I think maybe also giving you a chance either to kind of, actually, you know what, I think it's nice. Quentin's question, the last question, is a nice one for you to be answering before kind of, you know, wrap it all up nicely for us, given this was a very eclectic conversation and quite nice with the panel that we have. So Quentin's asking, how can humanizing tech ensure no one is left behind post-pandemic? Thinking of Africa and low vaccination rates, this may not have much ROI in the short term, but what is the bigger human cost if we do not focus on this? Agnes, I think that's a really interesting question. have a go at
Yeah.
it.
Wow, yeah, it's such a huge question as well, right? I think for me, this is a question of how do we ensure global equity and parity around vaccinations, not just vaccines, but also a new form of geopolitical collaboration. And it's going to get really dicey. And I think that we're in this era where we're seeing the tectonic plates shifting in terms of geopolitics, mainly driven by the strategic competition between US and China. In the past, it would manifest in infrastructural investments, right? So that from China, you have the Belt Road Initiative. Then going forward, it was manifested in the digital space and in the cyberspace. And who knows whether in the future it's going to manifest that strategic competition is going to manifest itself in health issues, using vaccine diplomacy, for example. Well, beyond that competition, evidently it is best for all of us if there is greater vaccine parity around the world, because we're so globally connected that we are not safe until all of us are safe. And this is one of the initiatives that Singapore and Switzerland was trying to be part of by setting up a sort of facility for vaccine parity. But at the end of the day, every country still reverts back to looking out for their own national interests, right? And it is not about, can we put aside that national interest? I think realistically, if you ask me as a very cynical civil servant, my answer is no. Every country will always look out for their own interests. The question is whether there's going to be a return of global leadership in the world today. And that is a big question for all of us. It would not just affect only our vaccination or global vaccination rates. It will impact the digital space. It will impact the technology space across all. So this is something that all of us face in common. And on top of that, according to climate and with climate change as well, right? So is there going to be a global leader that will be keeping, the world safe, have decent level-headed conversations, able to bring together global alliances and not have the world splinter up in AUKUS, Bunchier, another Trans-Pacific pact over there. Yeah, we're headed for interesting times.
It's a very interesting question, and I'll be heading it over to Steve for like a nice closing reflection on that. I think that could be a panel in itself, Agnes, and that's a wink to SGInnovate as well, or whoever wants to take it. But great question, maybe write a book about it. I'd love that. The role of one leader kind of bringing it all together. Steve, you raised your hand.
Actually, the leadership one is fantastic. But I'd also like to, given that we're talking about AI and we're talking about predictive when we talk about AI. So if you actually look now, we're having a very static look at this and a very focused look at today. Whereas the reality is, if we look at global populations, China will not be much bigger than the US by the turn of the century, which is quite startling, right? Their population will halve in the next 45 years. So, and then you have a look at some of the emerging markets where we're talking about vaccines. Though, Nigeria, I think, will be the third largest country. So, you're starting to see this huge shift, not just in geopolitics, but actually in population all around the world. So those markets will become increasingly important. And, what we do today will shape how leadership grows in the future there. So vaccines and access, we're taking a very short-term view of preservation today, but I think we really need to think and start using predictive models to start bringing a real view of how these things might evolve in the future and what we can do today that changes the course, because we're not headed in a good direction right now.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because it covers both, technology ultimately augmenting the human effort. And of course, it's also doing the exact opposite when it comes to leadership, leadership actually taking the role of, just charging ahead and demonstrating a way of how it can be done better, which I think is both exactly what we'll be needing. And of course, this is a conversation that can be going on pretty much forever, because the humanization of our transformation is probably one of the most pressing, if not the most exhilarating and fascinating issues of our current times and is probably as a conversation topic around to stay. I'd like to be closing the panel by inviting each of our panelists to a little complete the sentence exercise. Basically, you're completing the sentence, humanizing transformation in a hybrid normal is what? And I'll give everyone a chance to just have a quick one. You know, Agnes, I'm just going to throw it back to you. Maybe you just give it a go.
Yeah. Okay. Is about taking the machine out of the equation. It's not man to man. It's not about machine or man or machine. It's man to man. And that includes women as well, by the way. I want to be very clear about that. At the end of the day, it's just getting down to the pure basics, having a talk with each other to say, what is your point of view about this? What are your concerns and challenges around this? Sensing your whole stakeholder system.
Nice. Ros, how about you?
Look, it's necessary, right? Technology is just
it.
an enabler. It's the human element that never goes away.
Nice. Wonderful. Steve?
It's all about learning and giving people access to learning so they can make informed decisions.
And I think that's a very wholesome way of concluding here for us. This conversation, as eclectic as it has been, I think is definitely an ongoing one. And I do believe that there is really kind of a story, a silver lining of us using the pandemic as a catalyst for transforming our attitude towards technology and the way that technology is augmenting the humanity which is connecting us all. With that in mind, I think we can be looking forward to a very optimistic future, and I think that's very much what all of us will be wanting. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm Philip Christian. Thank you to our panelists, Rosaline, Steve, and Agnes, and thank you for SGInnovate hosting this kindly and allowing us to have this conversation. So cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Philip.
Bye.
Thanks.